Addressing Gettysburg.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. As always, good to see you here. My name is Christopher Gwynn. I'm the Chief of Interpretation and Education at the park. And we have a very exciting program that's going to be a little bit different than the ones that maybe you've seen previously. Before we delve into that, though, a couple of announcements. As always, if you do have a cell phone, please turn that to off or to silent. I will again encourage you, if you've missed a lecture or simply want to rewatch one, head to our friends Addressing Gettysburg's YouTube page, where all of the winter lectures have been filmed and are uploaded. And as always, we're very grateful to Matt Callery and his team for doing that for us. Tomorrow, apparently, there is an athletic competition that's taking place. And I know many of you are Swifties, so you'll want to make sure you catch that. So there's no winter lecture tomorrow. We will resume next weekend, however, and we hope to see you here in the theater at 1:30. Moving on to our presenter, Mr. Chris Davis started his National Park Service career in 2010 at Rocky Mountain National Park, working as a seasonal vegetation monitoring specialist. Since then, he served in a variety of capacities at several national parks and regional offices, including Yosemite National Park, the NPS Northern Great Plains Inventory and Monitoring Network, which I bet you didn't even know existed, but it does. He came to Gettysburg in 2021, and in September of 2023, accepted his new role as park biologist. His education and professional expertise are in invasive plant ecology and management, native vegetation restoration, and ecosystem monitoring. In his current role here at Gettysburg, Chris enjoys exploring management strategies that support biodiversity and ecosystem function, while also maintaining the fundamental look and feel of a landscape as it was in 1863 during the Battle of Gettysburg. In his free time, Chris enjoys traveling the mid-Atlantic with his family, trail running, cooking Mexican food, and I'm sure much, much more. I want to welcome him to the winter lecture stage, so please join me in welcoming Mr. Chris Davis.
Thanks, Chris.
There you go.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? This is the first time I've said anything through the microphone, so. Okay. Louder. Okay. I'm not a loud guy, so I'm going to have to try. I promise. I'll do my best. Thanks for the great introduction, Chris. I have actually a slide that I was going to introduce myself with that I can totally skip over now, so that's fantastic. So I'm excited to be here. It's been mentioned to me that this is something a little bit different for the winter lecture series. I know they bring a lot of really skilled storytellers to this series, and so I'm honored and a little bit intimidated to be up here talking to all of you, but hopefully the story is engaging and you walk away learning something new. I will say that I noticed that some of the typefaces on my presentation changed at this computer, so I will take no credit for any of the artistic choices as we move through some of these slides. Like I said, I could skip over most of this. I was born and raised in Scranton, Pennsylvania, if you're into that sort of thing, coal country. Moved out to Arizona, got a bachelor's degree in biology there, moved up to Colorado, got my ecology degree where I studied invasive plant management and invasive plant community ecology. And Chris explained all the rest of that, so I don't need to do it. So what is my goal here today? So really simply, I want to describe how and why we manage natural resources at parks like Gettysburg National Military Park and Eisenhower National Historic Site. More specifically, I'm hoping to illustrate that natural resources management and cultural and historic resources management in the context of landscapes, they're not at opposition, they're complementary. You can't have one without the other in the long term in a sustainable sense. And sort of for a little bit of context, we could just review the National Park Service mission, and I'll just read it verbatim. Preserves unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. Nice. I love the Park Service mission. I sleep well at night. The purpose of Gettysburg National Military Park. Similarly, to preserve, protect, and interpret for this and future generations the resources associated with the 1863 Battle of Gettysburg during the American Civil War, the Soldiers' National Cemetery, and then their commemorations. And similarly, Eisenhower mission, preserve and interpret the home and farms of the Eisenhower family. So at the highest levels, our mission is to preserve and protect natural and cultural resources and provide for access and education for folks who visit these places. Step a little bit out of my comfort zone here and talk about history. This is a really superficial overview of resources management at the parks. We could have an entire presentation just on this alone. There are books that exist that describe just this. So really quickly, 1863, the battle occurred. Immediately afterwards, the Gettysburg Memorial Battlefield Association was formed. Their goal was to acquire lands to preserve parts of the battlefield that were important to the battle. 1895, Gettysburg National Military Park was founded, transferred to the War Department for management, and this is when the commemorative era began. So building of monuments and all of those things that we associate so strongly with the battlefield nowadays. During that time period, in 1916, the National Park Service was founded. In 1933, Gettysburg was transferred over to the National Park Service for management. Thus began efforts in modernization here and across the Park Service as a whole, improving access by building roads, establishing creature comforts, comfort stations, visitor centers, lodges in some cases. Following the effort of modernization came the 60s, and kind of the environmentalism awakening. Silent Spring is a really famous book that people attribute to bringing some of these issues to light, the problems that have occurred following industrialization of the country. During the 60s and 70s, as a result, we got things like the Wilderness Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, and a variety of executive orders, including the Wetland Protection Act, that still guide our management policies to this day. So I can't overstate how important the 60s and 70s were to natural resources management policy. Leaping forward to 1999, the park developed its general management plan. And so here's a map from the general management plan that I personally really love. And this map is showing how the landscape changed between 1863 and 1993 when work began on the general management plan. What is a general management plan? It provides decision-making guidance for park managers on how we manage the resources, natural resources, cultural resources. As you can imagine, a park has a lot of decision-making responsibilities, and the general management plan helps us make those decisions. It provides a framework. So if you look at this map, I know it's a little busy. If you ignore the boundary lines and if you ignore the roadways, essentially any place you see the map colored in, that's a significant change from 1863 conditions. So some of these lighter gray areas, that's places where forests moved out into the formerly open areas of the park, grasslands and pastures. Those black hatch mark areas, those are places where there were orchards originally, and they failed and weren't replaced over time. So as a result of the development of the general management plan and the treatment philosophy, it's a large-scale effort in the early 2000s to kind of roll back the landscape across the park to these original conditions. So that involved removing woodlands, restoring grasslands, and then restoring some of these orchards that were lost over time. And so you can see this is a lot of work back then, and it's a lot of work now to maintain these things as they are, frozen in time essentially. And so natural resources doesn't do it alone. Several divisions across Gettysburg National Military Park work together to manage these landscapes, but we're here to focus on the natural resources program. And I will say I named the talk Biology on the Battlefield because it sounded cool, alliteration, biology on the battlefield, but really I'm going to talk more broadly about how we manage natural resources in the park. So that's why I keep saying natural resources. And so really our program is focused on ecosystem management, keeping our forests healthy and functioning, keeping our grasslands healthy and functioning, keeping our wetlands and riparian areas healthy and functioning. That entails integrated pest management. We also do wildlife management. ecological restoration efforts. In addition to those things, we manage our historic orchards. We manage an agricultural permitting program to keep the agronomic look and feel of the battlefield. And we also welcome researchers to the park to study our ecosystems and tell us things that we don't know about our ecosystems. And so these are all the things I'm going to try to talk about in 40 minutes. I think I could do it. But because I'm trained as an ecologist, I think in ecosystems. And so that's going to be the structure going forward. I'm going to talk about all of those topics couched in ecosystems. And so I think when you, at this park, if you step back and you look broadly across the park, you can put ecosystems or habitats into 4 general categories: forests, grasslands, wetland, riparian, and aquatic habitat, and then those agrarian habitats like agriculture, crops, hay, orchards. And here's a map I created just to give you an idea of the distribution and magnitude of some of these habitats. You probably notice right away more than a third of the park is in farmland. That's either crops or hay. About a little less than the park, about a little less than a third of the park is in forest or woodlots, a little bit less than that in grasslands, and the remainder are orchards, wetlands, and riparian habitat. So you can see this is a complex patchwork of habitat. And with that complexity in habitat, we get complex biodiversity. In Gettysburg National Military Park in Eisenhower, and if I just say Gettysburg, I'm including Eisenhower, there are about 1,000 plant species known to occur in the park. There are more than 200 animal species known to occur in the park. This is including important pollinator species, scavengers, predators, and species that are rare or threatened or in decline in some way. That includes more than 70 species of special concern. And so what's a species of special concern? We have rare species. Rare species just means they're locally uncommon, typically because they're on the edge of their distribution. Threatened species, species that are at risk due to habitat loss, disease, land use changes, invasive species crowding them out of their habitat. And then we have endangered species. These are species that are likely to become extinct without direct management intervention, including species like the northern long-eared bat. So how do we manage all of this habitat and all of these species effectively? Adaptive natural resources management. And I promise this is the only conceptual diagram I'll make you look at this whole presentation. But I'll keep coming back to adaptive management, so I figured I should define it well right out of the gate. And so adaptive management is just a decision-making framework, okay? It's essentially a fancy version of the scientific method. So what I mean by that is adaptive management means you go and you make an observation of your resources. You say, okay, this is something that needs action. You determine what that action is going to be. You implement that action. You observe the results of that action. You take what you've learned and feed that back into the adaptive management cycle. So it's learning from your experiences. And so this is how we manage natural resources at Gettysburg and Eisenhower. I'm 99% sure most land management agencies think of adaptive management when they're managing their natural resources. And so I think one of the great examples of adaptive management in our park is our woodlot management program. So woodlots and forests in the park cover about 2,000 acres of area. Woodlots are forests that were formerly used by farmers in the area, and then forests are more naturally occurring forests. Really important component of the historic landscape. Forests would screen troop movements behind front lines, and also some significant battle action happens in some forests, Culp's Hill, for example. In the park, they foster a huge degree of biodiversity. Other things that happen in our forests and woodlots are science. So we have forest health monitoring plots out there. We have traveling National Park Service scientists who go collect data, report back to us the condition of our forests. We do some important bat monitoring out there. We do a lot of our pest management work in our forests, but our forests do face regeneration challenges. And I'll describe what that means in a second. But I do want to clarify that it's not just Gettysburg and Eisenhower that face regeneration challenges. Hardwood forests, generally in the northeastern part of the United States, are all facing similar regeneration challenges. So here's a picture of what I would call a relatively good condition forest in Gettysburg. You can see it's a mixed age stand. We have some low growing plants, some mid canopy plants, and then a semi-closed canopy formed by those adult trees. So during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was a lot of data collection happening in our forests. What the data were telling us was that we have great oldish growth forests, but what we're not seeing is good regeneration or recruitment of those same species that form that old growth canopy. They're not coming up in the sub-canopy, which will be a problem, right? If you just imagine forward a few years, you lose some of the canopy, you don't have those same species growing up to fill in that canopy. So you're gonna have a type change in your forest. And so the theory was that not enough light was getting down to the forest floor. So in the early 2000s, a plan was devised called health cuts. And so parts of the park were thinned somewhat to open up canopy sections of the park. And then rather than the desirable species, what we got was a lot of invasive species, okay? And so when we open up canopies here in Gettysburg, we tend to get Japanese barberry, multiflora rose, and a whole host of other invasive shrubs. And those invasive plants have the effect of crowding out and suppressing the growth of those desirable native canopy-forming species. So why is this happening? Our forests face a whole host of challenges. On the left, you can see some forest pests. That top one you might be familiar with, that's called emerald ash borer. In the last 10 or 20 years, emerald ash borer has swept through Pennsylvania and the eastern seaboard, decimating the population of ash trees that once formed a somewhat large component of the forests in Gettysburg. Also have hemlock woolly adelgid, also cause a high degree of mortality in hemlock thickets. Halfway down there, you might have heard of the spotted lanternfly. That's currently an issue that we're dealing with. Jury's still out on what sort of effects we should expect and what magnitude of effects to expect in our forests. We chose to take a proactive approach, and we're working with the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture on managing their progression through the park and through the state. And there are also newly emerging diseases like beech bark disease, and this is a picture of beech leaf disease. So, a lot of pressures on the already established trees. Other pressures that exist on the trees that are trying to get established include deer overpopulation and the invasive plant flush that I mentioned already. And so in our park, we have forest health monitoring plots. We have them in our park, and they're scattered throughout multiple parks on the northeastern side of the United States, northeastern national park units. And so park scientists took all of those data that they collected, synthesized them, and interpreted the data and found that the major drivers of the lack of regeneration that we see are overpopulation of deer and invasive species abundance. And they call this regeneration debt. So some places, our forests are doing really well. So if we were to remove the canopy, we would expect regeneration to appropriately fill in that canopy. A lot of places in the park, we don't have that. If we lose the canopy, we get invasive shrub thickets. So what do we do about that? First, we engage in invasive plant management, attack the problem at the source. We've been doing invasive plant management in the park for a long time. When I say we, I mean me and all of my predecessors. Decades of invasive plant management have been happening. So how do we do that? We use the full suite of tools we have at our disposal. So this is where the integrated pest management idea comes in. We use manual methods, hand pulling some species, they're able to be hand pulled. We use mechanical methods, whether that's chainsaws, brush cutters, mowers. We use prescribed fire in some cases, a really powerful tool for invasive species management if you time it right. And then We also use chemical applications, herbicide, targeted applications. You can see an applicator here using targeted backpack sprayer applications in our forests. So I think I mentioned some of the common species we deal with: Japanese barberry, winged euonymus. A new one that just got recently named to the noxious species list in Pennsylvania is Calorie pear. I don't think you can buy them at Home Depot anymore. They finally stopped the sale of those. And then herbaceous species like garlic mustard. And in this picture here, you can see tree of heaven, that fountain-like tree kind of scattered throughout. That's the preferred host plant of spotted lanternfly. It's a lot of work. We're a small team. Usually we have an ecologist, 2 biological science technicians, sometimes 3 depending on the season. So there's a lot of ground to cover, but we do get help. We get help from a traveling National Park Service invasive plant management crew called the Invasive Plant Management Team, Mid-Atlantic Invasive Plant Management Team. They come to us out of Shenandoah. And we also work with youth crews. They'll come, like the Youth Conservation Corps, for example, they come and help us. So we do have ways to bolster our ranks, so to speak, as we manage our invasive plants in the park. But it is a lot of work, and it's time consuming. And sometimes it's challenging to prioritize areas when you know you have limited power and scope. And so in the last year, this is very exciting, we developed an invasive plant management plan with the help of the invasive plant management team and with the inventory and monitoring scientists who have the data that they collect in our parks. And so the goal of this plan is to help us prioritize treatment areas. So the way this worked is we identified priority habitat management zones. And each of those zones, we went through an exercise where we applied priority scores to them based on their ecological integrity and value, their cultural resources significance, and how important they are to interpretation and education in the park. And so those are kind of the 3 things that I mentioned early on as the basis of how we manage the park, protecting resources and interpretation. And so we use this now. It helps us decide, okay, here's this habitat management zone and here's this habitat management zone. Given the limited resources that we have, we should focus on this zone. Another really powerful concept that came out of this plan and that we work with the inventory monitoring crews on is early detection and rapid response. And so again, we're a small crew. We're not everywhere in the park, but when we have these monitoring crews kind of roving around in places that we tend not to get to, they keep an eye out for species that are new to the park and are known aggressive invaders. And just this year, they identified some wavy leaf basket grass in the park. If you're familiar with wavy leaf basket grass, you don't want it. And it was new to the park, and there were only a few individuals, so we went out and hopefully nipped it in the bud. We'll follow up for the next few years to make sure we actually took care of that problem. So early detection, rapid response is a really important part of this whole strategy. And so here's what a successful invasive plant management effort looks like. Again, here's a technician. This is on Culp's Hill. You can see this is a lot of tree of heaven. And tree of heaven is one of these plants that you can't cut. If you have tree of heaven, don't just cut it and walk away, because if you cut tree of heaven, what it does is it sends up hundreds of suckers from its root system, and will continue to do so until you have a carpet of tree of heaven. So we did targeted herbicide application in this tree of heaven patch, and this is what it looked like the next year. So just to give you an idea, we got rid of a lot of those trees. It's still not perfect, but it never is when you're doing invasive plant management. You prioritize, you pick the worst problem, and you decide whether more treatments are required. We've been following up in this spot for a couple of years, and it still looks pretty good, so we did a good job there. So invasive plant management is happening. What's the other problem with forest regeneration in this part of the world? Deer overpopulation. In some parts of the country, white-tailed deer populations have exploded in response to the removal of predator populations. And so in this figure here, let's see. You can see pre-management activities, deer populations were as much as 4 times higher. This is deer density per square mile in the park than the recommended levels from the Pennsylvania Game Commission. So 4 times more deer in a given unit area in the park than what is considered healthy by the experts. So in response to this, in 1995, environmental impact statement was produced. And part of the environmental impact statement process is considering different methods of control of the deer population. It was decided and determined that the most effective and cost-efficient way to achieve the goals of the deer management program were lethal removal or hunting. So every fall and winter, Gettysburg staff and USDA Wildlife Services staff cooperate on the deer call program. And we remove deer based on population estimates where we collect those data in the spring. And you can see, post-management efforts, we're able to maintain the deer population around the recommended rates of density that the Pennsylvania Game Commission recommends. Another effect that I would see as positive from our deer management program, in Adams County in 2012, the first case of chronic wasting disease was detected. Chronic wasting disease is a degenerative brain disease communicable with, from deer to deer. The most effective way to manage the spread of chronic wasting disease in deer populations is to keep the population densities low. All of the deer that we remove from the park are tested for chronic wasting disease. Since we started testing for chronic wasting disease, we've had 0 positive detections, which is a good thing. Once those deer are cleared of chronic wasting disease, they're taken to a processor, a butcher, and the meat that results from those deer are then distributed to food pantries. And we do that work in cooperation with Hunters Sharing the Harvest. They help us locate butchers and they help us locate food pantries that are willing to accept the meat. In 2023, we donated more than 8,000 pounds of meat to food pantries in the local area. So we're managing invasive plants, we're managing our deer population, we're still seeing regeneration debt. So what's happening? We're not getting the trees back that we want. We're not totally sure, but it seems like active intervention is needed in the sense that we need to put the trees in the ground where we want them to grow, at least for now. There's a region-wide effort, a large-scale effort called the Resilient Forestry Management Initiative. This is just starting right now. We're having a meeting next week about strategy. I just saw that they posted the job ad for the program manager for the Resilient Forestry Initiative program for the Park Service. So it's an exciting time. You know, some parks either aren't doing the invasive plant management or they aren't doing the deer management. So we're a little bit ahead of the curve at this point. We've been doing these things and we've been doing them for a long time. Now we'll work with this regional initiative to determine what it is we need to do to bump our forests towards that self-sustaining behavior that we're hoping for. So we do a lot of work in our forests to maintain health, and because we do so much work to maintain these forests in decent condition, they're able to support biodiversity, forest biodiversity. I just wanted to highlight a couple species here. On the left, this is the federally endangered species, newly federally endangered species, the northern long-eared bat. So we have scientists come from Virginia Tech, and they do acoustic bat monitoring, mist netting, where they capture a bat and have it in hand, and they regularly detect northern long-eared bats in the park. They detect pregnant northern long-eared bats in the park, which is exciting. So this tells us that they're using the park for forage, to gather food, and possibly using the park to establish maternity roosts. So in addition to endangered species, our forests also support species generally in decline, like the red-headed woodpecker. So in addition to supporting species specifically, our forests support microhabitats within themselves. So these pictures are showing vernal pools. Vernal pools are ephemeral or temporary bodies of water. And so they're not fed, they have no inlet and no outlet. They're typically fed by snowmelt or seepages in the ground. Vernal pools support a host of species that rely specifically on vernal pools to complete their life cycles. So here we're out in the evening with some students from Gettysburg College and their professor, and you can see here these are egg clutches, and here's some bigger pictures of those egg masses. And so we have spotted salamanders and wood frogs that rely exclusively on these vernal pools to complete their life cycles. So I think that's fascinating. We have a habitat that supports a miniature wetland habitat. So stepping away from forests at this point, we'll segue into wetlands. We have them. We have 150 acres of wetland habitat, 26 miles of riparian habitat. And I'm probably going to say riparian over and over. Riparian habitat is the vegetation that exists at the transition from a waterway to the dry upland habitat, forest or grassland. So that's that intermediate habitat. And I'm sure you've heard that wetland habitat is really important. Why is that so? They provide a lot of benefits for the actually small proportion of land that they occupy. So unique habitat. Wetlands support a lot of species that rely exclusively on wetlands for their survival. About a third of threatened and endangered species in the United States are supported by wetlands. They improve water quality and supply. They do this by acting as natural filters. They filter out pollution and particulate matter and prevent them from moving downstream. They improve water quality and supply. So they slow the flow of the water, induce percolation into the soil, which then recharges groundwater tables. They reduce flood damage. They act as physical barriers and sponges. So when we have a high flow event, the water tends to slow down when they hit these wetland areas. And they maintain high levels of ecosystem productivity. They're nutrient storehouses. So they'll store nutrients, and then you have these high flow events. They'll release nutrients into the downstream habitat, serving to feed microorganisms and fish. And they also have an incredibly high degree of plant productivity. So plants tend to accumulate a lot of biomass in wetlands. And so the main stressors on the wetlands in the park are essentially pollution from runoff and degradation of the physical characteristics, so stream bank degradation, physically destroying the stream banks in these wetland and riparian habitats. So how do we handle this in the park? First, we report stormwater runoff best management practices as they happen. So best management practices includes removing hardened surfaces. So what you're trying to do is encourage the water to enter the ground rather than sheet over the ground and end up directly in a waterway. Reporting our efforts help us track our work and identify new places where we might be able to achieve better stormwater management. Oh, and I should point out, I put this map up here to highlight that here we are in Gettysburg. We exist within the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So all of our little waterways in the park, ultimately that water, some of it, ends up in the Chesapeake Bay. And so it's all interconnected, and that's why it's important to manage our water quality in the park. Another strategy we use is creating vegetation buffers in between farmland and waterways. Again, vegetation buffers, vegetated strips provide physical barriers between runoff and the waterways that we're trying to protect. This year we'll be working with our agricultural permittees to identify places that would be good candidates for installation of these vegetated wetland buffers. And finally, two things that we do to improve our water quality and our riparian and wetland habitat. I'm using the Culps Run Restoration Project, if you've seen this in the park. A few years ago, we worked with the Gettysburg Borough to implement this project, and I'll use this to talk about the rest of the strategies here. First, you can remove or exclude sources of disturbance that are having the effect of removing the physical integrity of the wetland or the stream bank. And so in this case, what we did was we removed pasturing cattle from this area. So the cattle were allowed free rein. They would walk around, cause a lot of disturbance. So we ended the pasture program there, and we're growing hay in a lot of the area where the pasture formerly was. So we remove the source of physical disturbance, and then you rehabilitate the wetlands and the riparian areas when you can. And here you can see what does restoration of these places mean. It means bringing back beneficial wetland vegetation and restoring meanders and slope and grade so that the water isn't flowing too quickly through these places. These pictures demonstrate that. Here you can see they put in some logs as physical barriers to the water moving through the run. This is early on in the establishment of the vegetation. And then you can see down here 1 year later, explosion of plant growth. And you could see, just based on that picture, how that would impede water from moving quickly over the landscape. I've been involved with a couple wetland restoration projects, and I love them because plants just want to grow in wetlands. So you get a lot of immediate satisfaction. You put plants in the ground, you come back next year, and it's really, really exciting. Here's another picture of the same project. Again, a lot of this disturbance is due to the activities that I described, regrading, recontouring, replacing natural meanders, and then 1 year later, vegetation coming back, helping to buffer the flow of water through these systems. And so, ultimately the goal of helping out these wetland and riparian habitats, what you hope to see is wetland species colonizing these areas that you're trying to improve. One of the wetland species we have in the park, the North American beaver. So I'm reading the room a little bit, and maybe you've heard of the beaver in the park. Yeah, I'm not going to avoid the topic. So the beaver, if we're joking a little bit, but if you're not familiar, we do have a beaver population in the park in the Plum Run corridor. Plum Run corridor is right below Little Round Top, one of the most visited places in the park, highly visible. You can see here, this is the beaver pond, here's the beaver den, here's the beaver dam. So very conspicuous on the landscape. And it's a hot topic. And I'm going to attempt to explain, from my perspective, why it's a hot topic, talk about how we're managing this and why. So, ecologically, beavers are important, right? When I put my ecologist hat on, I say, yes, beavers are important. Why is that? They're indicator species. When you have a beaver show up to your riparian area and decide that this is good habitat to live, it's telling you you have quality habitat here. And Plum Run is definitely quality habitat. The headwaters for Plum Run are in the park, maybe half a mile upstream. So it's good habitat. They're keystone species. A lot of other species rely on beaver activity to live, to carry out their life cycles. And they're ecosystem engineers. They create wetlands and they create ponds. And along with these activities come all of the benefits that I just described with wetlands, right? Increased water quality, reduced flood damage downstream, increased biodiversity and plant productivity. However, there is an increase in human-wildlife conflict when we have beavers, and this is not unique to Gettysburg. Every park I've ever worked in that had beavers, this has been a topic of discussion. So in this specific situation, what are the conflicts? Increased water levels, right? And so we have local flooding. When we have high water events, we tend to see water levels rise, like in this picture you can see here. That creates problems potentially with infrastructure like roads or with monuments. And that's what we had happen in Plum Run. There's a monument that's down close to the run, and eventually that monument became surrounded with water as a result of the beaver activities here. And it also impacts the historic viewshed. This is not what this valley looked like in 1863 at the time of the battle. I mean, one, this is fall, so there's no vegetation, but two, there wasn't a beaver pond there. And so we have two considerations, right? Ecological importance and cultural resources importance. When we're trying to strike a balance here, and it's not easy, right? And so the approach that the park has chosen to take is one of proportional response. That's one way to say it. I will call it adaptive management. We identify a problem. In this case, ecologically, this is fine. Cultural and historic resources wise, we were having impacts to a monument. And so the decision was made to install devices, pond drainage devices, beaver deceivers, beaver bafflers, whatever you choose to call them, These devices have the effect of taking water from above a dam, moving it through the dam, depositing it downstream below the dam. And you can see one of these devices, the bottom right. They work great. So we had 2 of those installed below the main dam here and then over here on the beaver's nose. And it effectively drained the water out of those places that where infrastructure and monuments were being impacted. And so here's what it looks like. So this picture here is taken right here. And so that channel is about 5 feet wide. Basically what we expect historically with plum run. So that was about a year ago we had these installed. So now we're moving into that part of the adaptive management cycle where we're stepping back and we're saying, okay, we implemented an action. How is it working? I think the original intent, and I still think the current intent, is that we're hoping to encourage the beavers to move along of their own accord. We don't want to remove the beavers from the park, right? Ecologically, they're important. They provide a lot of ecosystem services that we couldn't do without the beavers. But again, there is this conflict, human-wildlife conflict. So we're taking an iterative approach, trying something. If that doesn't achieve the results that we want, upping or considering something else, implementing that, and see if we could achieve harmony. You know, we're trying to find a balance, again, between these ecosystem values and these cultural and historic resources values. I know that won't be satisfying for everybody. It'll be satisfying for some of you and not satisfying for others. And I totally understand that, and everybody at the park understands that. And so I do want to highlight that these decisions aren't made in a bubble. We have an interdisciplinary management team, especially with high-profile resources issues like this. You know, we have natural resources and cultural resources specialists. We have facilities folks who specialize in roads and monuments. We have the interp division, we have law enforcement, we have administration, we have the superintendent's office all come to the table and decide what's best for the park in that moment. So one interesting thing I've learned about beavers and their activities is that, so they create these dams, and these dams act as silt fences. Over time, they accumulate more and more soil. Soil backs up, fills in the pond, and you get a really wet beaver meadow. Ultimately, the beaver meadow won't support woody species anymore, and the beavers rely on these woody species for their lives, right? They're building materials and their food. They abandon their complex. The dam starts to decompose, fall apart. Water is once again able to flow through the area. These beaver meadows dry out, and you get grasslands. And that's my cool segue into grasslands away from beavers. So grasslands, we have 800 acres plus of grasslands in the park. Again, historically significant component of the landscape. Most of the battle action occurred in the open fields of the battlefield. How are grasslands maintained? In this part of the world, a lot of our grasslands would love to grow up to be forests, right? So prehistorically, there were megafauna that would tear out plants and trample plants and keep these wide open, maybe flat areas. As we move into the human epoch, we had fires, we have pastures, we have farming to keep these places open. But ultimately, it's a lot of work to keep these open spaces open in the park. Grasslands in the park do support a lot of biodiversity. We have breeding birds in the park. We have a wide diversity of pollinator species that use grasslands in their life cycle. Challenges include land use conversion. That's not really an issue in the park, but it is an issue surrounding the park, and I'll get to that in a moment. And then again, invasive species. So land use conversion, let's talk about this for a quick second. This is a map showing conversion of agricultural land into human, how do I want to say this? High density use or low density housing areas. So things that animals that are used to open spaces won't use as habitat. And so you can see it's not an insignificant amount of agricultural land being turned into these places that animals that rely on grasslands won't use. So to me, what this means is that as more and more of these open spaces get converted into places that these species can't use, it kind of increases the sense of urgency for us to protect and support these grasslands that we do have in the park. And then invasive species. Talked about invasive species quite a bit in the forest ecosystem slides, but again, we do have a mosaic of grassland quality. Some of our grasslands are amazing. Some of our grasslands are really impacted by invasive species. Some of the places where we did a lot of tree removal tend to be heavily invaded, and it's taken a lot of work to kind of bring those back to functioning, non-invasive grassland ecosystems. So they have the effect of crowding out beneficial species, and they also displace species that pollinator species are tightly adapted to using for their life cycle. And so how do we manage our grasslands? First, we keep the grasslands where we want them to be, and so we maintain them where they are. And we do that through two approaches. First, we're controlling our invasive species. We do a lot of Canada thistle management out in our fields. For a while it was expanding. They form monocultures, crowd out a lot of those beneficial grassland species. Recently we've changed our tactics, and I feel like we're starting to get a foothold, and in some places we're seeing reduced abundances of Canada thistle in our grasslands, so that's exciting. Again, we get a lot of help with this work. IPMT once again comes and helps us cover a lot of ground in our grasslands. So we manage our invasive species, and we also do woody species management. And that's primarily achieved through mowing. You may have noticed late in the summer, early in the fall, there are tractors with mowers basically covering the entire park. And that's a mechanical method of controlling woody species establishment. Another thing we do is try to encourage grassland biodiversity. And this is another new region-wide, large-scale project that's just kicking off this year. Like I mentioned, some of our grasslands are great. A lot of our grasslands are degraded. This project will help us improve up to 500 acres of our grasslands in the park, so it's very exciting. The approach will be removing invasive species and also reintroducing a suite of beneficial native grasses and forbs into these habitats. This year we'll be starting with invasive plant management and then doing more work on strategizing rehabilitation efforts with planting. Sort of grassland adjacent, another thing that we do is we work with our farmers to establish hayfields. And so hayfields, not prime habitat for grassland species. However, grassland species will use them. So, it exists along a spectrum. So if we can't have pristine native grasslands, the next best thing perhaps is hayfields. And so we work with our farmers to establish hayfields, and we do that by incentivizing hay production. Essentially, we make it cheaper to grow hay here than it is to grow crops. Another thing we do to protect grassland bird species in our hayfields is that we've restricted mowing. And this goes for the landscape management branches mowing too. We push mowing back later in the season. So for hay removal, we don't allow hay removal until July 15th, and that allows for breeding birds to complete their life cycle. The fledgling birds are able to fly away if the mower does approach them. Similarly with the landscape preservation branch work where they mow the grasslands in the park, we don't begin that work until late in the summer, early in the fall. Again, allows the breeding birds to complete their life cycles, and also those pollinator species like insects to complete their life cycles and move along before the mowers come. So one of the exciting projects I think we have in the park is a bird improvement area. So this is an area that was formerly exclusively in crops. We worked with the farmer, agricultural permittee, to establish grasses in this area. In these plots, we limit hay mowing to July 15th through August 30th. Any other hay in the park, once July 15th comes, they can mow, and if they could get another crop off, they're allowed to do so. But in the bird improvement area, we limit it to just over a month. And that allows for continued winter habitat for these breeding birds. So this map shows, these are all plots that are part of this breeding bird monitoring program. This is co-managed between the park and the Mid-Atlantic Inventory Monitoring Team. And so there are plots. This red boundary here shows the bird improvement area, and outside, this is fields that are farmed typically, conventional farming. And so this is a volunteer run program. We, the Park Service, manage it, but by and large, it's volunteers that come out and do the work, and I'm hugely appreciative of this. Over the last 3 years, they've collected 4,500 observations of birds at these plots. This year is the third year of data collection, so if you're into stats, you know that once you have 3 years of data collection, you'll be able to do some trend analyses. So it's exciting. Later in the year, we'll be working with the ecologist who manages the program to kind of determine what we're seeing out in the bird improvement area. But the volunteer birders, who in large part come from the local Audubon Society crew, I wanted to mention that, so hugely appreciative of those folks. They've identified 6 obligate grassland species. That just means birds that have to have grasslands and good quality grasslands to complete their life cycle. And that includes, the dickcissel, the grasshopper sparrow, and the bobolink. If you're familiar with these birds, you know that these are specific to grasslands, and so it's exciting to see these species. Lastly, in our grasslands, we have the least shrew. This is a Pennsylvania state endangered mammal, known to occur in Gettysburg and in Eisenhower, but we don't have great data on where they exist and how many are in the park. So right now we're working with the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy and the PA Game Commission to implement a monitoring project across the park. We've identified good habitat for these animals. They're going to come and help us install the monitoring devices. These are passive monitoring devices, so there's no trapping, capturing, killing of these animals. And so this will help us understand where they are in the park and in what abundance. And again, we'll use that information, feed it into the adaptive management cycle, and decide whether we need to be changing our methods in some places to support the habitat for this endangered mammal species. And so this work starts this summer. Okay, continuing with the theme of open spaces. Like I mentioned, the park supports a large acreage of farming. Again, this is important to the historic landscape of the park. This is a largely agronomic community when the battle happened, and still is. And so exactly 2,178 acres of the farm are in agriculture. That's 1,835 acres of crops, 136 acres of hay only, and 207 acres of pasture. So we work with a really great group of agricultural permittees, and they do a lot of hard work out there. Again, they're keeping the historic fabric, that patchwork of habitat, intact. They're doing a lot of the work. We could never farm this land on our own as the Park Service, so it's a great cooperative effort between the two entities. I think one of my favorite things that I've learned about the agriculture program is where you see these farms currently in the park. In most cases, this is where they were at the time of the battle. In a lot of cases, farming never stopped on these lands. As land changed hands, eventually came to the Park Service, you could draw a line from 1863 through today, and farming continued on these properties. So these pictures I stole from our website. Maybe Jason, I don't know, did you take this picture? This is the McPherson farm. This is in July of 1863. And this is a current day photo, and you can see, active farming happening off in the background here. So I think that's a really cool component of the ag program. Finally, we'll talk about historic orchards. How am I doing on time? Great. We have 36 historic orchards in the park. They cover 160 acres. They contain more than 3,000 fruit trees. That's a lot of trees. We manage our orchards for appearance. We don't manage them for fruit production. The other way I say this is we manage with a light touch. We try to keep the trees alive, and we try to keep them free of disease the best we can. So again, as a result of the general management plan, early 2000s, into 2012, orchards were reestablished in the historic places where they once existed. Here's the famous peach orchard. The peach orchard it does get a little more attention from us than the remaining orchards in the park. It's a really high-profiled orchard, so we try to take extra special care of the peach orchard. And like I mentioned, we don't manage for fruit production. However, some years we get a bumper crop, and last year was one of those years, which I think surprised a lot of us. It was particularly dry, but we got a lot of peaches. And one of the things we need to do with the peach trees is take those peaches off so they don't break the branches. So last year, and we do this periodically, we cooperate with the Gleaning Project. They came to the peach orchard and helped us take the peaches off the trees. Ended up getting 1,200 pounds of peaches off of our trees, and all of those peaches were donated to local food banks. So I like that part of the story. So like I said, the vast majority of the orchards in the park are apple orchards. Again, 3,000 trees in these orchards, so it's a lot to manage. So I'm going to do a little pitch right now. I'm currently working on a volunteer program, an orchard management volunteer program. So if you have any interest at all in helping out, I'm going to have my email up here at the end. Get in touch and we could talk. I do want to point out a lot of the work that we do in our orchards. We get a lot of help from the Olmsted Center for Landscape Preservation. This is a Park Service office. They help us devise management strategies and the like. We work with Penn State Ag Extension. There's a fruit tree production office up there in Biglerville. And so finally, I feel like I've talked a lot and covered a lot of ground, and there's still some things I didn't talk about. We have a prescribed fire program, touched on that briefly. It's on hold right now while the fire management plan is being revised, but we have an active prescribed fire program. We host large volunteer groups to help us with vegetation management, thicket clearing. We're an outdoor classroom. In a sense, we host Park Service classes on orchard management. The local college, Gettysburg College, brings students to observe natural resources in the park, collect data, and they have some forest plots in the park. And we invite researchers. We have some researchers who study Lyme disease prevalence in the park. We have a couple of researchers who look at pollinator diversity in the park. And we even have some geological research going on studying the diabase intrusions that you see down in Devil's Den. So, thank you for listening. Thanks again, Chris, for inviting me to talk to you. And I want to thank the cooperators. As I went through the talk, I tried to highlight the places where we get help from outside entities. Also, the biologists and the ecologists who came before me, they've established a great natural resources program that we can build on moving forward. And also, again, we can't manage natural resources in the park without the help of all the divisions in the park. And I just want to say we have a great group of folks in the park who work collaboratively and cooperatively, and we have a really good situation here. So I'm happy for that. So thank you again for listening, and I think we have some time for questions. That is an excellent question. I would say when visiting different parks, check your boots. That's one of the easiest things that you could do when you're walking on trails. You get back to your vehicle, turn your boots over. If they're muddy, tap them out in place. Try to not transport weed seeds from park to park. Yeah, let's call it the Bradford pear from now on. We'll make a policy change.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Cool.